Hey, this is Rick Caselge, and I'm going to go through the first exercise in unlocking your hip flexors. So with this exercise, it's three-way leg swing, and what we're doing is we're dynamically stretching the hip and the hip flexors in all different planes of movement that the hip ends up doing. Now I'm going to get Michelle to go through the exercise, and I'll kind of highlight the key points that you need to remember when doing the exercise. So the first thing is, ideally, what you want to do is keep the pelvis parallel to the floor. So you might want to step onto something, because if you end up doing the exercise off the floor, what will oftentimes happen is your pelvis will end up being tilted. And with the pelvis being tilted, it's not what we want to do. We end up imbalancing the pelvis, which is definitely what we don't want to do. So the first exercise that Michelle ends up going through is she's going to stand on like a pad or like a foam book, something that ends up taking her off the floor about an inch or two. Now, if you don't have something to stand on, it's fine, but it's not ideal. So the first one she ends up doing is she's going to end up swinging the leg forward and back. So standing on one leg, keeping the pelvis square, and then swinging that leg forward and back and trying to go a little bit further every single time. So with this one, we're dynamically stretching the muscles in the hip in the forward and back direction, and also we end up warming up the tissue in the muscle so that we can end up unraveling all the muscles and tendons around that hip. So we end up doing that 5 repetitions each way, and then we end up moving into the next exercise when it comes to this dynamic stretch. So we went forward and back, now we end up going side to side. So Michelle's standing on the pad, and then she's gonna swing her leg out in front and start small and then try to go bigger and bigger. And then as the movements end up getting bigger, you're trying to add movement in that hip, in this hip, and trying to rotate through that hip. Now just go with whatever range of motion that you can end up doing when it comes to the movement. And just like the one before, we're going 5 repetitions each way. And then lastly of this set, this kind of warm-up set, dynamic stretch set, we're going to end up going at an angle. So she's ending up going at a 45-degree angle. And with this one, you're starting off small and then you're going further and further. And with the further parts, you end up working on rotating that hip that you're standing on and the rotating that hip that you're end up kicking with. So now with that first exercise, what we end up doing is warming up that hip, and it ends up being ready for the other exercise that we're going to go through in order to unlock those hips. Okay, now we're going to move on to the second exercise, and this one ends up being quad stretch with opposite arm overhead. So this one ends up being a static stretch, and Michelle's going to demonstrate. So bringing that, pulling the heel towards the seat, and then you're looking for a light stretch in the front of the quad, and then you're going to intensify it by bringing the knee back, but you want to stay tight in the abdominal area and not change that pelvis that much. So bringing the knee back should intensify that stretch in the quad and in the front of the hip. Now you can progress this and make this more difficult by bringing the opposite arm overhead, and that'll end up preventing you from bringing your upper body too far forward and decreasing the effectiveness of that stretch. But just as Michelle was doing, if you have poor balance, you can end up putting your hand on the wall. It's more important to do the exercise right and get a good stretch, then bring that arm overhead. Okay, moving on to the third exercise, 90-90 kneeling stretch with arm overhead. So with this one, you move from standing and you move into a 90-90 position. So you're looking at the front leg, ankle, knee, and hip being at 90, a little bit more forward, yep. And then with the back leg, looking at the hip, knee, and ankle at 90 degrees. And then ideally, what you're looking at the back foot, you're looking at flattening out that back foot. That'll end up intensifying the stretch. So it's best not to have shoes on, but if you have to wear shoes on, that's fine. You just end up getting a better stretch with your shoes off. Now, other things that you're looking at, you're gonna tighten up the abdominal area. You're gonna bring this arm, so left side, left arm straight overhead, and then you're going to contract your glutes and bring your hips forward. And you're looking at getting a good stretch right through that front of the thigh, and then it'll end up carrying on into that hip area. Now, depending on where you're tight, for some people it ends up being all in the quads. So that ends up meaning that that's the area that you end up being tight in. If you don't feel much in your quads, you'll probably feel it into your back, up into your spine, into your psoas muscle. Now with this one, just like the second exercise, we're looking at holding the stretch for 20 seconds, and we're gonna alternate sides and then end up doing it twice on each side. You're looking at a light stretch. You're not trying to rip apart the muscle. You're looking at a light stretch, because if you end up overstretching or going too hard, the muscle will end up contracting in order to protect that muscle from being damaged. Okay, with this fourth one, there ends up being two different options that you can end up doing. I'm gonna go through a table option, so the table hip flexor stretch, and then there's gonna be an option that you can end up doing on the floor if you don't end up having a table. So the first one ends up being that table hip flexor stretch. So you're in front of a table or a plinth, you're gonna bring one leg in behind you, and then you're gonna kind of grab it with the opposite hand. And then what you're gonna end up doing, same side, so right leg up, right hand overhead, and then you're gonna end up side bending. So bending towards the side, bending through that back area, bringing that hip out. And what you end up looking for is a stretch throughout the knee, abdominal area, and all the way up through the arm. Now, if you don't feel very much, what you can end up doing is bringing that knee more outwards, and that'll end up intensifying the stretch. Now, if you don't have a plinth, we'll do an exercise on the floor that you can do as an option, or if you don't feel this one, then you can end up doing the one on the floor as an option. How long you end up holding this? 20 seconds, and then you end up doing it twice on each side. And this one ends up being a little bit different. It ends up being a fascial stretch, because we end up targeting all the muscles from the knee all the way up into that arm area. And a lot of times the whole body ends up tightening up around that pelvis area. So we want to unwind everything in that pelvic area. Okay, this ends up being option B for the fourth exercise if you don't have a bench or plinth. With this one, we're doing the 90-90 hip flexor stretch with arm overhead with side bend. So you're going from a standing position, you're going down to that 90-90 position as we did with the exercise before. And one thing I want to end up highlighting with this one is we got the 90 in the front, 90 in the back leg ends up being flat. And then we're gonna bring this arm straight overhead with the palm facing that way, and then we're gonna add a side bend. Key thing we're remembering is bring that pelvis out, bending through the back, and with this one, you should end up feeling it more in the pelvis area, more deep in that pelvis area, as opposed to the other one, which ends up being more into the spine. Now with this one, once again, we're going twice on each side, holding each stretch for 20 seconds. A common mistake people end up making is, we talked about the foot, but another one ends up being people end up bringing that heel in, and that'll end up offloading how much of a stretch ends up happening in that iliacus, front of the quad, front of the hip area. So what you want to do is you really want to make sure that the heel, knee, and hip are in a perfectly straight line. Now, if you don't really feel much of a stretch, make sure you're doing the technique correct. If you're doing the technique correct, another way of tightening up the muscle ends up being bringing that heel out just a little bit, and then you'll end up intensifying that stretch. Now, key things to remember with this, ends up being a static stretch, we're looking for a light stretch. Other things that we want to remember is that we're kind of incorporating breathing with things. So you're trying to relax, you're trying to breathe through your abdominal area, you're trying to breathe in through your nose, have that breath come into your abdominal area, and then you can end up breathing out from your nose or your mouth. And when you breathe out, you're trying to blow out the tension that is in the muscle. And that'll end up helping for you to get more effectiveness and more out of this stretch. Okay, moving into the fifth exercise, we're gonna move on to our backs, and this one ends up being knees in and out on your back. So you're gonna move into your back, laying on your back. And with this one, It's a common exercise. People bring the feet together, bring the knees together, and then drop the knees side to side. That ends up being a back exercise. Now, how we want to change this and really end up targeting the hip flexors is we end up separating the feet and we end up separating the knees. And we're going to drop the knees to one side. So now we're focusing more on the hip movement, the hip rotating in and out. And we're gonna rock to one side and then we're gonna rock to the other side. So you're gonna rock to one side, you're gonna hold for about a second or two, 1, 2, and then we're gonna rock to the other side. Now, if you don't feel very much, then you can separate the feet and knees more. So you separate them more, good, and then you're really focusing on that movement happening in the hip as opposed to in that back area. And this ends up being oftentimes a muscle or a movement in the hip flexors that people end up missing, that rotation in that hip. And when it comes to that rotation in the hip, oftentimes it ends up being overactive and tighten people because they end up having poor stability in their core and in their hips. Now, a key thing to remember when it comes to the whole routine ends up being you're trying to focus on what you're doing. You can't be distracted and thinking about other things, what you're gonna do tonight, with a list of things that you need to do, or what that ends up doing is taking away from your routine. So you end up you're wasting time and you're taking away from the benefits or the most that you're gonna end up getting out of this routine. Okay, moving on to the sixth one. This one ends up being hip rocking and mobility. So you go from a standing position and we go into a 4-point position. And with this one, what we're looking at is finding that position where we can end up isolating hip movements. So in this position, rocking your hips back, what ends up happening is we end up getting lower back movement and we end up getting hip movement. And what we want to end up doing is just focusing on hip movement happening. So we're going to go back into that 4-point position. We're going to separate the knees a little bit further, and then we're going to kind of rock back, and we're looking at a point where we're not getting any low back movement. It's not any curling of the low back. It ends up being all in the hips. When we find that point, we're going to come back into kneeling. We're going to go into 4-point, and then we're going to go into kneeling. And a lot of times this knee position ends up being like our squatting position that we end up doing, any type of front squat or back squat. So now we're going to go from the 4-point position into like a kneeling position. Yep, so I'm going to get you to kneel up. Good. So we're in this position, and now what we're going to do is the mobility side of things. So before this was the rocking. So we find that right position, and now we're end up going to that mobility and working on the mobility exercise. And with the mobility exercise, it ends up being different than the other ones because what we're working on is the capsule, targeting the capsule of the hip. So not a muscle, not a tendon, but where that hip joint we're working on. So we're going to rock the hip to one side, and the force ends up being at like an angle. So we're kind of moving, kind of putting that light force through the hip joint in order to kind of open up that hip joint. So we're going to rock from one side, then we're going to rock to the other side. So we're rocking back and forth, going over 1, 2, 1, 2, and 1, 2. So you're doing a couple repetitions each side. So roughly like 3 repetitions each side, a total of 6. And then from this way, you're gonna go back to the start, and now we're gonna go at an angle. So angle, putting that force here, and then 1, 2, other direction, 1, 2, other direction, 1, 2. And so we're working on stretching out that capsule, giving more space for the hip joint, and so we end up getting better hip movement. Now, looking at all the exercises that we've kind of gone through, it ends up being in a sequential flow. So what we're trying to do is unwind the muscle so that we can end up going deeper and deeper into that hip flexor and getting better and better movement in the hip, so you can end up improving your power and strength and vitality when it comes to the exercises into a specific flow. Okay, moving into the 7th one, we're kind of in that kneeling position. We're gonna move right into the next exercise. So with this one is kneeling back extension. So you're gonna take your hands, you're gonna put them on your hips, and what you're gonna do is you're gonna end up arching back. So you're bringing the hip forward, we're looking at hip extension, we're arching the back, and then we're gonna come back out in front. So you're gonna end up doing like 5 repetitions, and you're gonna arch back, hold for 2 seconds, 1, 2, and then come back. Now with this one, we're doing another mobility exercise, but we're doing mobility exercise in the back, but also in that hip area. Because a common thing that people end up having is they end up sitting a lot, and that ends up tilting or ends up affecting that hip area. So what we want to do is kind of promote that extension of the hip by bringing the hip forward, because most of us end up being in too much hip flexion, which ends up being the way we are when it comes to sitting. So we want to work that opposite direction when it comes to the back and when it ends up coming to the hip. Okay, moving on to the 8th exercise. This ends up being heel into the wall, and this ends up being a PNF stretch that we're doing. So we move from the kneeling position onto our stomachs, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna end up moving towards the wall. And when it comes to the wall, you're lying down in a good position. What ends up working best is like placing your forehead into your hands so that your spine ends up being in a good alignment. What we're looking at doing is lie on your stomach, you're gonna bring that heel up, and then what you're gonna do is end up having that knee straight into the ground, and you're gonna push your heel into that wall, and you're pushing at not maximum, just 10% for just 6 seconds. And then you're gonna relax, and then you're gonna push in again. And going through that 1 set, 6 repetitions, each time done for 6 seconds. And this one, what we're trying to do is we're contracting the muscle in order to get the muscle to relax. So you end up going through it on both sides. And other keys to remember is you don't want the leg out to the side too much. You want to try to keep it in line with that hip, ideally. You don't want to bring it out to the side too much. And you're really trying to remember working on the rotation of that hip. You're not focusing on bringing that leg out, you're focusing on bringing that heel out and rotating through that thigh. Now, if you end up having really good movement in that hip area, what you'll end up having to do is move a little bit out away from the wall. Good. So let's say you end up having good movement, you end up moving into the wall, and then you end up pushing in. So if you end up having good range of motion and really trying to focus on that rotation happening. Perfect. And so you can see we're end up using all kinds of concepts, all kinds of modalities when it comes to addressing the hip flexors. Because what I've ended up finding is just focusing on one modality like static stretching ends up providing temporary solution. It doesn't end up being a long-term solution. You have to end up utilizing all kinds of different modalities like the PNF stretching, fascial stretching, mobility exercises, dynamic stretching exercises, and static exercises, plus a couple other ones. Okay, now we're on to the 9th exercise, front plank to side plank. So moving from a standing position down into that front plank. So you're gonna stack the arms, and then the rest of the body's in good alignment, head, shoulders, hips, ankles, and you're going from that front plank position to a side plank position, holding for about a second or two, back to the front, and then moving from the front to the side. 1, 2, back to the front. Now, if this ends up being too easy, you can start adding the leg kicks, bring the leg up, other side. Key thing you remember, you're focusing on the glutes doing the work and no arching in the back. Then you move to the side, and then you lift that top leg out to the side, good, back down. Same thing, only hip movement happening, no back movement. And going with the leg kicks, good. And then the other side, good, and back to the front. Now with this exercise, we're focusing on the modality of core stability. And that ends up being important because in the rest of the sequential flow, what we've done is we've unwound the hip flexors and the hip tightness, and now we need to end up adding stability in the proper muscles around the hip and the back. And that's what we end up doing with this exercise and the next exercise. Okay, now we're moving on to the last exercise, the single leg glute bridge. So you're gonna go from standing, you're gonna lie back on your back, you're in your good position, you're gonna tighten up the abdominal area, you're gonna bridge up, and then what you're gonna do from here is you're gonna straighten out one of the legs. So you're gonna straighten it out, hold it for a second or two, come back, and then you're gonna switch sides, but you're gonna keep your hips up good. Straightening, 1, 2, back to the start, alternating sides. So you can end up going back and forth. Now, if this progression ends up being too hard for you, what you can end up doing is just focusing on just a bridge like that. Good alignment from the knees, hips, and shoulders. Now with this exercise, what we're doing is we're focusing in on the muscle activation side of things. So with this one, a lot of people, because they sit for a long period of time, end up losing the activation in their glutes. So with this exercise, we're targeting the glutes, we're waking up the glutes. And as you saw with all the exercises, we're really focusing in on perfect movement. So we really want that movement to happen in the hips and not in any other part of the body, especially the back. So there you go, that ends up being the 10 exercises in the Unlock Your Tight Hip Flexors.